She was on her knees in the snow, not because she had fallen, because they had thrown her there. The doors of Ashenveil Manor slammed behind her with the finality of a coffin lid, and the mountain did not care. The wind took her name and scattered it across the frozen dark. 22 years old. No pack. No wolf. No one. And yet, the iron cuff on her right ankle, the one the elders had called a blessing, the one she had dragged through 19 years of cold stone floors, began to glow. Not red, not orange. White. The kind of white that has no temperature. The kind of white that exists before fire decides what it wants to be. Inside the manor, 300 of the most powerful wolves on the continent were raising their glasses. They were toasting their alpha's wisdom. They were toasting her exile. And not one of them felt the ground begin to tremble. 3 questions are going to follow you through this story. Why did they chain her before she could walk? Who is the king who arrives tonight with shadows in his eyes and a secret older than his throne? And what happens to a world that mistakes a sleeping god for a servant girl? Stay with me, because the girl in the snow is about to remember something the world spent 2 decades trying to make her forget. Before we go any further, if you love stories about women who were buried and came back as earthquakes, smash that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss a new story. We drop cinematic tales like this every single week. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Her name was Mara Ashveil. Not a coincidence that she shared the name of the manor. The elders said it was charity. The old alpha, Dorian Voss, had found her on the steps of the gate the winter his own daughter died. He named her after the house because she belonged to it, they said, the way a chimney belongs to soot. For 22 years, Mara had lived inside the walls of Ashenveil Manor in the territory of Cold March, a Highland fortress pack carved into the granite face of the Arden Moor Mountains. Cold March was not the largest pack on the continent, but it was the oldest, and in the world of wolves, age was currency. The hierarchy here was a living thing with teeth. At the top, the alphas and their lunars. Below them, the betas who sharpened their influence like blades. Below them, the warriors, the scouts, the ranked wolves whose inner beasts gave them a seat at the table. And then, somewhere below all of that, in a category that didn't even have a proper name, was Mara. She was what the pack called a hollow. A wolf born without a wolf. No inner beast. No enhanced strength. No heightened senses. No ability to shift. In a society built entirely on the power of transformation, being hollow was not a disability. It was an insult. To the pack. To the bloodline. To the moon herself. At least, that is what they told her. Every morning, Mara arose before dawn. She lit the hearths in the upper corridors before the ranked wolves woke. She polished the obsidian floors of the great hall until she could see her own face in them. A face she rarely looked at directly. She laundered the alpha's hunting gear in water cold enough to blue her fingers. She was invisible in the way that furniture is invisible, present, functional, and beneath notice. She was 22 years old, an age when most wolves had been mated, ranked, and settled into their place in the order. Mara's place was on her knees. She bore 3 marks of her status. The first was the iron cuff on her right ankle, a dull, rust-bitten ring that the elders had clasped around her as an infant. They called it a grounding seal. They said it kept her hollow heart from fluttering into dangerous rhythms. It was heavy enough that she had developed a slight, almost imperceptible limp on cold mornings, and she had learned to hide it the way she hid everything else. Quietly, efficiently, without complaint. The second was the absence of a scent. Every wolf had a signature, a biological perfume that broadcast their rank, their lineage, their emotional state. Mara smelled of nothing but the cleaning compounds she worked with. Lye soap, ash, cold water. To a wolf, smelling of nothing was the olfactory equivalent of not existing. The third was her eyes. This was the mark she could not hide, no matter how she tried. They were the color of deep amber in ordinary light. But in darkness, or in moments of strong emotion, they shifted. They became something ancient and unsettling, the color of molten copper threaded with veins of gold. Pack members who caught her eyes at the wrong moment would look away quickly, with the expression of someone who had accidentally looked directly at the sun. They never said anything about it. Neither did she. Mara had spent 2 decades constructing a fortress of smallness around herself. She did not speak unless spoken to. She did not eat at the communal table. She did not look up when the Alpha entered a room. She had learned, through 100 small cruelties and 1 or 2 large ones, that visibility was punishment. The belief was simple. I am safest when I am nothing. I am nothing. Therefore I am safe. She was wrong about the safety. She was catastrophically wrong about the nothing. Calder Thane did not announce himself when he arrived at Ashenveil Manor on the night of the winter convergence. He didn't need to. The horses pulling his black iron carriage were larger than any natural breed, their breath rising in twin columns of silver vapor. His personal guard, 8 warriors in matte obsidian armor bearing no insignia, moved with the synchronized precision of a single organism. And Calder himself stepped out of the carriage door the way a glacier moves, without hurry, without hesitation, with the absolute certainty that whatever stood in his path would eventually yield. He was the Alpha King of Vorath, the sovereign of the northern reaches, the ruler of 7 packs and 17 territories. He was 31 years old and had held the crown since he was 19, which meant he had spent 12 years being the most powerful and most isolated man on the continent. He was built like the mountains that surrounded his citadel, broad, angular, seemingly immovable. His hair was the color of charcoal and worn short, almost severe. His eyes were a gray so pale they were nearly colorless in daylight, and at night, when his wolf pressed close to the surface, they turned a deep arterial crimson that made ranking wolves instinctively drop their gaze. He was magnificent. He was a fortress. He was entirely, profoundly alone. Calder wanted control. He had spent 12 years building systems, political alliances, treaty frameworks, laws designed to prevent the kind of chaos that had taken his father. He wanted every variable accounted for, every threat neutralized before it could breathe. But Calder needed something he had no vocabulary for, something that lived in the hollow space behind his sternum that all his power and all his strategy had never been able to fill. His wolf had not spoken to him clearly in 3 years. The connection between an alpha and his inner beast was supposed to deepen with age. Instead, Calder's wolf felt like a fire burning lower each year, a slow, quiet extinction he had told no one about. Not even his most trusted advisor, Commander Reva Holt, knew the truth. Calder had confused strength with invulnerability. He had built his identity so completely around the image of an unmovable king that he had forgotten what he was made of underneath the crown. He did not know how to receive. He had spent 12 years giving orders and making decisions and carrying the weight of 7 packs, and he had never once let anyone carry even the smallest fraction of it back. He was coming apart at the joints. He had traveled to Cold March for the Winter Convergence, the annual summit of the Northern Packs, under the pretense of political oversight. 3 packs in the Ardenmoor region had been in a territorial dispute for a year. He was the arbiter, but his wolf, faint, flickering, barely audible, had pulled him north 2 days earlier than the summit required. He didn't know why yet. Mara was pale gold in a world of cold stone. She moved in silence, in early mornings, in the spaces between. She was warmth hidden under ice. Calder was the ice. Immaculate, crystalline, perfectly formed, and cracking from within. The elements were already finding each other. Neither of them had been told to expect it. The Winter Convergence feast was Ashenveil Manor in its full, terrible glory. The great hall, the floor Mara had polished for 6 hours that afternoon, blazed with the light of iron chandeliers holding 200 white candles. The long obsidian tables were set with silver service and crystal that caught the firelight and threw it back like applause. 300 wolves in formal dress moved and breathed and laughed, and the combined weight of their auras made the air feel thick and electric. Mara was not a guest. She was moving between the kitchen and the hall with a service tray, her head down, her ankle iron hidden beneath her uniform trouser leg, navigating the crowd with the practiced invisibility of 2 decades. She did not see Calder Thane enter the room. She felt him. The air changed. It was the only way to describe it. The ambient noise didn't exactly stop, but it shifted register, the way a conversation changes when someone authoritative enters. Every ranked wolf in the room adjusted their posture by some small fraction. The collective unconscious of the pack recognized a superior predator and responded without being asked. Mara's tray tilted, not because she was frightened, because the iron cuff on her ankle suddenly burned, a specific, directed heat she had never felt from it before. Her step faltered. The tray compensated, but one crystal glass slid to the edge. She caught it, barely, and when she looked up, instinctively, across the full length of the gleaming hall, Calder Thane was already looking at her. Not scanning the room, not surveying his political landscape. Looking at her. His pale gray eyes had gone very still. His nostrils had flared by a fraction that most wolves in the room wouldn't have registered. His hand, reaching for a glass of offered wine, stopped mid-motion. Mara looked back down. Her heart was a trapped thing behind her ribs. The cuff burned. Then Alpha Dorian Voss appeared at Calder's elbow, effusive and performance-bright, clasping the king's arm and steering him toward the high table, and the moment, if it had been a moment, ended. But Calder did not stop tracking the girl with the service tray. And his wolf, silent for 3 years, said one word. Her. It was Commander Riva Holt who found Mara an hour later, in the corridor behind the kitchen. Riva was a woman built for war and blunt truths. Close-cropped dark hair, a jaw that looked like it had been designed to withstand argument, and eyes that evaluated everything as either an asset or a liability. The king wants to speak with you, Riva said, without preamble. Mara stared at her. I think you have the wrong person. I don't make errors regarding persons, Riva said flatly. Follow me. The room Calder had been given for the summit was the manor's best. Fire, dark timber, the smell of pine, and old books. He was standing at the window when Mara entered, still in his formal coat, his hands clasped behind his back. He turned. In the private firelight, his pale eyes were warmer than she expected. Still dangerous, but warmer. You are the Hollow, he said. Not cruel, just direct. That's what they call me, Mara said. What do you call yourself? The question was unexpected enough that she answered honestly. Mara. He studied her for a long moment. Something in this manor is affecting my wolf, he said, his voice carefully neutral. It started the moment we crossed the Cold March boundary, and it sharpened significantly when I saw you. Mara's chin lifted. I am a Hollow. I have no wolf. I cannot affect another's. I know what you are supposed to be, Calder interrupted quietly. I am telling you what I am experiencing. A silence stretched between them, complex and taut. I am not here to harm you, he said, but I need to understand what is happening, and I cannot do that across a banquet hall. I am asking you to speak with me, plainly, without the pack watching. One conversation, Mara said finally. I am not a mystery for you to solve, King Thane. Something moved behind his gray eyes. Something that looked, unexpectedly, like relief. No, he agreed. You're not. The cuff on her ankle pulsed once, like a second heartbeat, and went quiet. The Winter Convergence ceremony was the pack's most sacred event. At midnight, the alpha of each represented territory would stand in the circle of offerings, a ring of salt and ashwood carved into the manor's inner courtyard, and reaffirm their submission to the lunar calendar. Their wolves would surface just enough to send a pulse of aura into the combined circle, a demonstration of pack unity and strength. Mara was not supposed to be there. She was supposed to be clearing the kitchen, but Calder had asked her, quietly and specifically, to watch from the colonnade above. She had gone because the cuff was burning again, and because 22 years of being told to stay invisible had generated in her a specific, bone-deep hunger to simply witness something real. The ceremony began. 15 alphas took their positions in the circle. The salt glowed faintly blue as their power fed into it, a gentle, collective display of controlled dominance. Then Calder entered the circle. His aura hit the salt like a depth charge. The blue light spiked white. 2 of the lesser alphas stumbled. The crowd made an involuntary sound, half awe and half animal deference. And then it happened. The white light in the circle stopped expanding outward. It turned. It moved, like a living thing with a direction, across the courtyard floor, up the colonnade steps, and stopped directly at Mara's feet. The entire assembly of 300 wolves followed it with their eyes. Found Mara. Found the girl who smelled of lye soap and ash. Found the iron cuff on her ankle, which was now glowing with a light that was not white or blue, but the deep, shifting amber of her own impossible eyes. The silence was absolute. Alpha Dorian Voss's face had gone the color of old chalk. Calder stood in the center of the circle, his pale eyes fixed on Mara, and his expression was not confusion or calculation. It was the expression of a man who has spent 3 years in the dark and just seen a door. Elder Sorka Vane, the oldest and most severe of Coldmarch's council, stepped forward from the shadows of the colonnade. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence, it carried to every ear in the courtyard. "Seal her," Sorka said. She was looking at Mara, and then she looked at Dorian Voss with an expression that contained, unmistakably, 22 years of shared guilt. Before she remembers, Calder did not let them seal her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply turned his full aura toward Elder Sorka Vane and said, in a tone that had ended political careers, "You will not touch her." The courtyard held its breath. Sorka did not buckle immediately. She was old and she was proud, and she had kept a secret for 22 years, which had given her the posture of a woman who believed she was right. "King Thane," she said carefully, "this matter falls under Coldmarch jurisdiction." "Nothing under my jurisdiction falls under Pact jurisdiction," Calder said, "and I am making her welfare my jurisdiction. Now." He looked at Mara, who had not moved from the colonnade step, who was staring at the fading amber light around the iron cuff with the expression of someone hearing a song they had always known the words to but had never been allowed to sing. "Come down," he said. Gentle, not a command. She came down. The new normal established itself over the following 4 days in a series of small, charged moments. By the protocol of the Convergence Summit, Calder was required to remain at Ashenveil for 5 days while the territorial dispute was formally mediated. He used every margin of those 5 days. He requested Mara be temporarily reassigned from domestic service on the stated grounds that she was a person of interest in an anomalous convergence event requiring further Crown assessment. This was accurate. It was also incomplete. The truth was that his wolf had not gone quiet again. For the first time in 3 years, the connection was live and urgent and warm, and every time Mara was not in the same room, it dimmed by a fraction that he had begun to find intolerable. He did not tell her this. Instead, he gave her access to the private library off his assigned quarters, on the grounds that any documents pertaining to the Ashenveil lineage and historical convergence anomalies should be reviewed. He told himself this was investigation. Mara told herself the same thing. They were both lying. She sat at one end of the long library table with the historical records. He sat at the other, working through the summit documents. The fire was between them. The silence was almost comfortable. Almost. "You don't look at the fire the way other people do," Mara said on the second evening, not looking up from the text she was reading. Calder looked up. "What do you mean?" "Most people look at a fire and relax. You look at it like you're deciding whether to trust it." He was quiet for a moment. "I suppose I look at most things that way." "Including me?" "Especially you," he said. And then, carefully, though the assessment is shifting, Mara turned a page she hadn't actually read. The cuff on her ankle had not gone cold since the courtyard. He brought her meals from the main table when she missed communal dinner, without comment, without ceremony, placed beside her elbow as he passed. She corrected an error in his treaty language on the 3rd day, quietly, on a scrap of paper pushed across the table. He implemented the correction without being asked how she had known. On the 4th morning, she rolled up her trouser leg to examine the cuff in the library's morning light. She didn't know he had come back to retrieve a document he'd forgotten. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the rusted iron around her ankle, at the faint new light moving within it, and at her face, open in the unguarded way that people are only when they believe they are alone. He left without announcing himself. He did not get any work done that morning. On the 4th evening, Mara found a document. It was archived in the oldest section of the library, a hand-copied genealogy chart so old the ink had turned the color of dried blood. It was titled, Lineage of the Aurelian Strain, a record of suppression and survival. She read it 3 times before she understood what she was looking at. She didn't hear Calder come in. She didn't hear anything until his hand closed gently over the edge of the document, steadying it, because her hands were shaking badly enough to tear it. Mara, this says, she started, stopped, tried again. This document says the Aurelian Strain is a bloodline of wolves whose power is sealed at birth if the bloodline is considered a threat to the existing hierarchy. It says the seal is iron-based, applied to the dominant limb. It says the seal doesn't suppress the wolf. She looked up at him. Her amber eyes had gone fully gold. It says the seal is the wolf. They didn't lock my wolf away from me. They locked my wolf into the iron. 22 years of my own power, caged against my own skin. Calder sat down slowly in the chair across from her. His face was doing something complicated and controlled. How much of this did you already know? Mara asked. Not enough, he said. I knew the Aurelian Strain existed. I believed it was extinct. Every record I have access to says the last Aurelian heir died during the Cold March succession crisis 23 years ago. He paused. 23 years ago. The math hung in the air between them. A year before you appeared on the manor steps, he said. Mara felt the floor of everything she had built her identity on shift beneath her feet. Dorian knew, she said. It wasn't a question. Dorian's father likely initiated it, Calder said. His voice careful with a controlled fury she could feel radiating off him like heat. The Aurelian Strain in its full expression produces a wolf of sovereign rank. An alpha above alphas. It would have ended the Voss family's dominance over this region permanently. So they chained me. The words were flat and very quiet. They chained me before I could walk. And they called it a blessing. Calder leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his pale eyes direct and very serious. I am going to tell you something that I have not told another living person, he said. My wolf has been dying. For 3 years the connection has been fading, and I have no reason and no remedy, and I have been carrying it alone, because a king cannot be seen to be failing at the most fundamental thing a king is required to be. Mara stared at him. When I crossed the Cold March boundary, the connection came back, Calder said. Not partially, fully. And when I saw you in that hall, my wolf said one word and has not been silent since. He held her gaze. I believe you are the reason my wolf is alive. And I believe that whatever you are, whatever the Aurelian Strain is, it is not a threat. It is the thing the hierarchy built itself to fear because it cannot be owned. Mara looked down at the iron cuff. At 22 years of cage pressed against her skin. I don't know who I am without it, she admitted. Her voice was very small and absolutely honest. No, Calder said, but I think you're about to find out. The summit ended in 24 hours. After that, Calder would return to Vorith. Mara would return to the floors and the silence and the cold water and the cuff that was now an entirely different kind of terrible secret. Unless something changed before dawn. We are exactly halfway through this story, and I need to know. Are you completely losing your mind right now? Drop it in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now because the next 20 minutes are going to change everything. Let's keep going. On the final morning of the summit, Calder did the thing that could not be undone. He stood before the assembled pack leaders in the great hall of Ashenveil Manor, at the head of the obsidian table, and he delivered the ruling on the Ardenmoor territorial dispute. It was just, precise, and bore the unmistakable structure of arguments refined through 4 days of late-night library sessions with a hollow who was, it turned out, incisively intelligent. And then, before the summit officially closed, he did something that was not on the agenda. I am also issuing a royal decree of protective custody, Calder announced, his voice filling the hall. Effective immediately, Mara Ashveil is placed under the formal protection of the Vorith crown. She is to be relocated to the northern citadel pending a full investigation into the historical record of the Aurelian Suppression Clause, which I have this morning determined to be a violation of the 7th Covenant of Pack Rights. The hall went very quiet. Dorian Voss was on his feet. On what grounds does the king presume to remove a ward of this pack without consultation? On the grounds, Calder said, his voice dropping to the register that ended things. that the iron cuff currently worn by this woman constitutes a form of biological imprisonment that the Seventh Covenant specifically prohibits. And on the further grounds that your ward, as you call her, is wearing 22 years of your family's fear on her ankle, and I find that I am no longer willing to allow it. The room was the sound of 300 wolves recalibrating. Mara sat at the far end of the table, where Riva Holt had quietly placed her an hour before, and she felt the warm, terrifying expansion of being publicly claimed as worth protecting. It was the most frightening thing that had ever happened to her, because now they could see her, all of them, and every wolf in that room had just watched the king of Vorith put his name between Mara and 300 years of Cold March tradition. Elder Sorka Vane, who had not spoken since the courtyard, rose from her seat at the council table. Her face was the careful blankness of a woman who has decided that if the dam is breaking, she will choose what floods. Before the king proceeds, Sorka said, there is a matter of prior claim. She reached into the fold of her cloak and produced a document. Old, sealed with the mark of the Voss bloodline. 22 years ago, Sorka said, the Aurelian heir was not merely suppressed. She was contracted. The word fell into the hall like a stone into still water. Contracted to the Cold March pack in perpetuity. By blood seal. Her power, upon awakening, belongs to the Alpha of Cold March. Sorka's eyes moved to Dorian Voss, who looked like a man watching a fire he had started finally reach the building he lived in. She cannot be removed by royal decree, Sorka continued, because she does not belong to herself. Calder found Mara on the manor's east balcony an hour later. She was standing in the cold without a coat, looking at the Ardenmoor peaks, and she didn't turn when he came out. He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him. Tell me what you're thinking, he said. I'm thinking that I spent 22 years being nothing, Mara said, her voice very steady in a way that took effort, and now I am apparently a property dispute. You are not a property dispute. The contract says otherwise. The contract is going to be a problem I solve. What I need you to understand right now, Calder. She said his name without the title, which she had not done before. He went still beside her. What happens after you solve it? What happens when the Crown's investigation is complete and the decree is formal and the contract is voided? I go to the Citadel. I learn what I am. And then what? He was quiet for a long moment. Below them, the mountain exhaled cold wind. I have been a king since I was 19, Calder said. I have made 200 political decisions in those 12 years, and not one of them has had anything to do with what I actually wanted. I am very skilled at that. I am very skilled at identifying what serves the crown, and what serves the territories, and what serves the covenant, and doing that thing regardless of its personal cost. He turned to look at her profile. I do not know what to do with the fact that what serves me, what my wolf has been starving for, is standing on a balcony in the cold without a coat and arguing with me about property law. Mara finally looked at him. His pale eyes were open in a way that his face was not publicly open. Undefended. I am terrified, she said quietly. I have been small my whole life on purpose. Because small things don't get noticed. Small things don't get targeted. You are asking me to be large, Calder. You are asking me to be the thing that document says I am. And I don't know how to do that without you. And I don't know how to need someone I met 5 days ago. And I am deeply, completely. She stopped. He reached out and tucked a strand of wind-thrown hair back from her face. His fingers were warm against her cold cheek. He didn't pull his hand back. I know, he said quietly. She leaned into his hand by a fraction, so small it was almost nothing. It was everything. The balcony door flew open. Riva Holt's face was a controlled emergency. My king. Now. Calder moved without asking. Mara followed, because the cuff on her ankle had gone from warm to blazing in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The courtyard below was chaos. A delegation of wolves in black had arrived through the manor's western gate. They wore no pack insignia. Their faces were covered by masks of hammered iron, crude and deliberate. Behind them, they had brought something that sent a cold, atavistic terror through every wolf in the courtyard. A sealed iron vessel. A container the size of a large chest, covered in suppression runes, radiating a frequency of wrongness that made the air around it feel sick. What is that? Mara heard herself ask. Riva answered, her voice low and tight. That is a soul forge. It's an artifact from the pre-Covenant era. They were used to extract the power from Aurelian wolves and transfer it to the controlling pack. Permanently. Mara's blood went cold. They're here for me. They've been here since the ceremony, Riva said grimly. They waited for the decree. They waited to see whether the king would publicly identify you. They have the contract. They have the forge. And they have. She stopped. Because the man who stepped out from behind the iron vessel was not a masked operative. It was Dorian Voss. He looked at Calder with the expression of a man who had run out of room. I didn't want this, Dorian said. The words sounded almost honest. Almost. The contract precedes me. My father made the arrangement. If she awakens and the power transfers to Cold March, we survive the next century. If she awakens freely, we are nothing. You understand survival, Thane. Surely you understand what a man does for survival. I understand what a coward does, Calder said, his voice ablaze. Dorian's expression hardened. Take the girl, he said to the masked operatives. Calder shifted. Not fully. The Alpha King's partial shift was a weapon in itself. The air around him went red with his aura. The temperature dropped 5 degrees, and every ranked wolf in the courtyard stumbled back a step. He put himself between the operatives and Mara. Riva was already moving, her weapon drawn. And then the cuff broke. Not gradually. Not with the warm, pulsing glow it had shown in the library or the courtyard. It shattered. The iron cuff cracked along a fracture line that had not been visible a moment before, and the pieces fell from Mara's ankle in a cascade of rust and metal fragments. And the sound they made hitting the courtyard stone was the sound of a chain. Of 22 years. Of every floor she had ever scrubbed, and every meal she had eaten standing up, and every time she had made herself smaller to survive. Mara looked at her bare ankle. At the mark the cuff had left behind. Not a scar. A brand. Glowing amber gold, shaped like a howling wolf mid-shift, surrounded by a ring of characters in the oldest script in the supernatural world, reading simply. The sovereign does not sleep. She waits. It wasn't gradual. Mara's legs gave out as 22 years of suppressed power detonated upward through her nervous system simultaneously. Calder caught her before she hit the stone, but his own aura flared wildly in response. And in the confusion of the light and the noise and the operatives surging forward, Riva's shout cut through everything. The forge, they're activating the forge. If it locks onto her while she's shifting, it will trap the power in the vessel, and she will never. The sound from the soul forge was like a drill through the ear. Every wolf in the courtyard collapsed. Calder was on his knees, his arms still wrapped around Mara, his teeth bared in an expression of pure refusal. He was fighting the frequency with everything he had. It was not enough. His vision was graying at the edges. The operatives were 3 feet away, and Mara, blazing and half-conscious in Calder's arms, opened her eyes. They were not amber. They were not gold. They were white. Mara understood 2 things simultaneously. The first, the soul forge was a frequency weapon. It worked on the same principle as the iron cuff, resonance suppression. It found the signature of a wolf's power and drowned it. The second, she was the Aurelian strain. And the Aurelian strain did not have a frequency. It was the frequency. Every other wolf's power existed on a scale, a range of energy that could be targeted and disrupted. The Aurelian power was not on the scale. It was the scale itself. It was the source frequency from which all wolf power derived, which meant the forge could not lock onto it any more than a shadow could swallow the sun. She did not know how she knew this. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat. It had always been true. The cuff had simply told her, every single day of her life, that it wasn't. She reached inside herself to the place where 22 years of caged warmth had lived against her skin, and she opened it. Not all of it. Just enough. She pressed her hand flat against Calder's chest, against the sternum, over the place where a king kept his dying wolf, and she gave him back what the years and the isolation had taken. She poured light into a man who had forgotten he was made of it. Calder gasped. His wolf, fully, roaringly alive, erupted. The soul forge exploded. Not with violence. With rejection. The vessel's runes cracked and went dark as the combined frequency of the Aurelian sovereign and the king of Vorith's awakened wolf exceeded every parameter the forge had been calibrated to contain. The masked operatives were thrown backward by the shockwave. The iron shattered into harmless fragments across the courtyard stone. In the sudden, ringing silence, Calder stood up. His aura was no longer a weapon. It was a declaration. He reached down and lifted Mara to her feet. "Can you stand?" he said. "Yes," she said. And she could. For the first time in 22 years, she could stand without the weight of the iron pulling her down. And the feeling was so enormous it almost felled her again for an entirely different reason. Dorian Voss had not run. Mara had expected him to run. He was, at his core, a man who had made 22 years of cowardly decisions to avoid a single hard one. Instead, he stood in the courtyard with the expression of a man who had just watched the cliff he was standing on fall into the sea. "The contract," he said. His voice had lost its authority completely. "The contract still is void," Calder said. "On the grounds of the forge attempt alone, Coldmarch forfeits every claim in the original agreement under the terms of the Covenant's good faith clause. You know this, Dorian. You have always known this." Dorian's gaze moved to Mara. Something complicated moved through his expression. Guilt, fear, and beneath them, something older. "Your mother," Dorian said, almost to himself. "She looked at me the same way, the night she brought you here. Like she could see exactly what I was." Mara felt the words hit her sternum. "My mother. She was alive when you were left on these steps," Dorian said. "I told the pack she was dead. She wasn't. She asked me to hide you. She said the Aurelian bloodline was being systematically eliminated, and you were the last one, and if they found you they would do exactly what we just tried to do." He stopped. "I convinced myself the cuff was protection, that keeping you small was keeping you safe. But somewhere between the first year and the 20th, the protection became convenience. The honesty of it was worse than a lie." Mara said nothing. Riva appeared from the manor's interior at a run, her expression grim. "My king." The operatives weren't working alone. The group that deployed the forge, they're a faction called the Ironright Collective. They've been active across 6 territories for the past decade. They have 3 more soul forges. She paused. And they weren't here only for Mara. They were cataloging the king's response. "They now know you're connected to her. They'll use that." Calder's jaw set. "They'll come for her again," Riva said. "And next time, they'll come for you both." The twist came from the least expected direction. Elder Sorka Vane had been silent through the courtyard collapse, through the forge destruction, through Dorian's confession. She had stood at the colonnade's edge like a woman waiting for a sentence to be passed. When Calder turned to her, she spoke before he could. "I was the one who brought the document to you," she said. "The lineage record in the library. I archived it there 14 years ago. I needed someone with crown access to find it." She paused. "I have been trying to end this for a very long time." The silence was absolute. "You worked for Dorian," Mara said. "I worked for the pack," Sorka said. "When Dorian's father initiated the suppression, I was a junior elder. I was told the girl would be released when she was old enough to understand the situation and make her own choice. I believed it. For approximately 4 years, I believed it." Her voice, which had always been dry and authoritative, carried something cracked in it. "By the time I understood that Dorian had no intention of releasing her, I knew too much. And men who are afraid make very clear what happens to people who know too much." She looked at Mara directly. "I have spent 14 years building a paper trail and waiting for someone powerful enough to use it." Her eyes moved to Calder. "I sent a copy of the Aurelian lineage record to the Vorith Crown Archive 2 years ago. Anonymously." Calder went very still. "The document I couldn't trace the origin of. The document that made you come to the convergence in person instead of sending a delegate," Sorka confirmed. The entire architecture of the story reorganized itself. Calder had been maneuvered here. Sorka had pulled the thread years before it needed to be pulled, had placed the information in the right hands, and had trusted time to bring it to the surface. The Soul Forge attack was not a response to Calder's decree. The Ironright Collective had been monitoring Coldmarch for years, waiting for signs of the Aurelian activation. Sorka had known they were coming. "You used me as a catalyst," Mara said slowly. I used the truth as a catalyst, Sorka said. And I owe you 22 years of apology that I do not expect you to accept. But I need you to understand. She reached into her cloak and removed a small, sealed letter, the wax bearing a mark that made Mara's amber-white eyes widen. Your mother is alive. She has been in hiding in the settlement of Braywater since the night she left you here. She wrote this letter 7 years ago and gave it to me in the event that the suppression was ever broken. Mara took the letter with hands that were absolutely steady. She did not open it. She pressed it against her heart and closed her eyes. And the glow around her skin softened into something very simple. Something that looked, against all the odds of everything she had survived, like hope. They left for Braywater at dawn, not in the king's formal procession. Calder stripped the carriage of its insignia, took Riva and 4 trusted guards, and they rode hard through the mountain pass in the gray-blue light of early morning. Mara rode beside him, the letter still in her coat, the bare skin of her ankles still adjusting to the unfamiliar lightness of being unchained. Braywater was 3 hours east through the Ardenmoor passes, a settlement of perhaps 200 people tucked into a valley where the mountains created a natural shelter from northern winds. It was small and unremarkable and completely invisible to anyone who didn't know to look, which was, of course, the point. They were an hour out when the Ironright Collective found them. 6 riders, iron masks, moving fast from the tree line above the pass road. Calder's wolf erupted before the riders reached them, his aura throwing a shockwave down the pass that forced 3 horses to rear and throw their riders. Riva and the 4 guards moved with disciplined lethality into the gap. Mara felt the frequency coming before she saw the weapon, a handheld version of the forge mechanism, small enough for one person to carry, pointed directly at her. She didn't shift. She didn't have to. She raised her hand and disagreed with the weapon's existence. The rejection wave she sent was controlled, precise. The handheld forge's runes went dark. The operative holding it stumbled as if a weight had been removed from the air. On the ground, Riva said, her blade at the operative's throat. The operative looked at Mara from behind the iron mask. You don't understand what you are, the operative said. Not threatening. Something almost desperate in the voice. The Aurelian strain, it's not sovereignty. It's a liability. Every pack on this continent will come for you. We were doing you a mercy. You were doing yourselves a service, Mara said calmly. She reached over and removed the iron mask. The face beneath it was young, younger than she expected. A boy, perhaps 20, with frightened eyes and the pack mark of a territory she didn't recognize burned into his jaw. Who told you the Aurelian strain is a liability? She asked. He hesitated. Someone powerful enough to build a network across 6 territories, Calder said, arriving beside her. Someone who has been afraid of this bloodline for longer than this boy has been alive. The Ironright matriarch, the young operative said finally, his voice breaking somewhere in the middle. She said the sovereign wolves destabilized the natural order. She said if the last Aurelian awakened, the pack hierarchy would collapse. She said we were protecting the world. Mara looked at him for a long moment. What's your name? He blinked. What? Your name? Finn. Finn, Mara said. Go home. She turned back, toward Braywater. The Ironright matriarch was not what Mara expected. She had imagined someone like Sorka. Old, gray, constructed of ideology. The woman who stepped out of the stone building at the center of Braywater's central square was perhaps 50, with the build and bearing of someone who had fought in physical territory disputes, and eyes that were calculating and genuinely, unsentimentally afraid. Her name was Varen Cast. She had no pack allegiance that Calder's intelligence had been able to trace. She had built the Ironright Collective from the ground up over 15 years, recruiting from disillusioned wolves, from packs that had lost ranking disputes, from anyone who believed the hierarchical structure was fragile and the Aurelian bloodline was the thing most likely to shatter it. She was not entirely wrong. The hierarchy was fragile. It had been built on the suppression of the Aurelian line. Its stability was predicated on a foundation that was, at its core, a crime. The forged technology, Calder said, standing in the square, Riva and his guards flanking him. You'll give us the locations of the other 3. And in exchange? Varen asked. In exchange, the destruction of the Forge network is what I report to the Continental Council. What you chose to build, and why, is a conversation for the Council's tribunal and not for a mountain square. Calder's pale eyes were steady. But understand that if you force my hand, the conversation becomes significantly less comfortable for your organization. Varen looked at Mara. Really looked. The fear was still there. But something else entered it. Something that was almost reluctant respect. The strain is exactly what the records say it is, Varen said, almost to herself. I built 15 years of work trying to prevent that. You built 15 years of work trying to prevent accountability, Mara said. The words were not angry. They were clear. The hierarchy is afraid of me because I can't be owned. That's not my instability. That's yours. Varen's jaw tightened. Then, slowly, she reached into her coat and produced a folded document. Locations, access codes, the full infrastructure of the Ironright Forge network. She held it out to Riva. The council will want to know how it was funded, Varen said. I'll cooperate. But I want it on record. She looked at Mara one last time. I want it on record that I was afraid. Not malicious. Afraid. I know, Mara said. So was every person who ever put a chain on someone they didn't understand. They found her in the valley behind the settlement. A woman sitting on a stone wall in the cold morning, looking at the mountains with the patience of someone who had spent a very long time looking at horizons. I saw Ashveil, Mara's mother. She was 50, and she looked it. But her eyes, amber gold, the same impossible color, found Mara across the field and filled with something too complex to be called simply grief or joy. Mara walked to her alone. Calder stayed at the settlement's edge, which was the right thing to do, which he somehow simply knew. Mother and daughter stood in the cold for a long moment without speaking. The letter, Mara said finally. I haven't read it yet. No, I wanted to read it with you there, so I could ask questions. I saw his breath hitched. She reached out and took her daughter's hand, running a thumb over the brand on Mara's bare ankle. Does it hurt? Not anymore, Mara said. I saw her closed her eyes briefly. Then she reached into her own coat and produced something small, a document, formally written, sealed with the Aurelian Sovereign's seal. This is the original suppression contract, Isara said. Not Dorian's copy. The original, with both originating signatures. It proves the suppression was initiated under duress with fraudulent lineage claims, which voids it retroactively under the Covenant's founding articles. She looked at Mara. I've been holding this for 22 years. I needed you to be free before I gave it to you. Otherwise, they could have used it to accelerate the forge process. She pressed the document into Mara's hands. Take it to the Continental Council, Isara said. With the King's testimony and the Forge Network's exposure, this ends the Ironright Collective's legal standing permanently. It also formally establishes your sovereignty claim. She paused. And then, she said softly, come home. Whatever home means now. Mara looked at the document. At her mother's hands. At the mountains. It means somewhere warm, she said finally. And no more cold water. Her mother laughed. It was a sound that sounded like something being healed. The Continental Council convened 3 weeks later in the neutral territory of Gravane Hall, a 7th-century-old building that had hosted every major supernatural legal proceeding in recorded history. 12 pack leaders, 7 elder councils, the representatives of 14 sovereign territories, and Mara Ashveil, standing in the center of the council floor, with her mother beside her and Calder Thane standing slightly behind her in the position of a witness rather than a sovereign, because this was her floor, and he had understood that without being asked. She was dressed in amber and white. No iron, no cuff, no uniform of service. The brand on her ankle was visible above the line of her boot, glowing softly in the afternoon light through the council hall's high windows. She presented the evidence in order. The original suppression contract and its fraudulent foundations. The Ironright Forge Network's documentation, with the locations of all 4 devices now in Crown custody. The historical lineage of the Aurelian strain, cross-referenced with 3 independent archive sources, including Sorka Vane's 14-year paper trail. And the testimony of Elder Sorka herself, delivered in writing and in person, with the specific, legally binding admission of complicity that had cost the old woman more than she made visible. The council deliberated for 2 hours. The ruling took 12 minutes to read. The Aurelian suppression clause and all contracts derived from it were retroactively voided as violations of the Covenant's founding articles. The Ironright Collective was formally dissolved, its forged technology destroyed under council supervision. The Cold March territory of Ashenveil was placed under a regency council pending the establishment of a new governing structure that did not rely on the suppression of sovereign bloodlines. And the Aurelian strain was formally reinstated in the Continental Registry as a recognized sovereign bloodline, with all rights and protections thereto. The council hall did not erupt in applause. It went very quiet instead. The quiet of a room full of powerful people realizing that the architecture of their world had just been fundamentally, permanently altered. Calder reached forward and briefly touched the back of Mara's hand. She turned and looked at him. His pale silver eyes were completely unguarded for the first time in 12 years. "Well done," he said softly. "We're not finished," she said. "No," he agreed. And he was not talking about the council. The changes came slowly, as real changes do. The Cold March territory did not collapse. It reorganized, painfully and imperfectly, around a new council structure that included, for the first time, representatives from the Hollow and unranked members of the Pack community, the people who had, until that winter, been categorized as beneath representation. The Ironright Collective's dissolution left a vacuum in 6 territories that had been relying on the organization's black market forged technology for power suppression of inconvenient individuals. The vacuum was uncomfortable. It was also, ultimately, clarifying. Packs that had suppressed their own members to maintain a hierarchy discovered that the hierarchy they had been protecting was significantly less stable than the truth it had been suppressing. 3 pack leaders voluntarily surrendered their suppressant contracts to the council in the 6 months following the ruling. It was a beginning. Dorian Voss did not fight the regency process. He aged 10 years and 2 months, which was what happened to men who had been holding a secret that heavy for that long. He retired to a small estate on the Ardenmoor's lower slopes and was occasionally seen walking the mountain paths alone, looking at the horizon with the expression of a man trying to outpace his own conscience. He never managed it. Sorka Vane was formally censured by the Elder Council for her complicity in the suppression. She accepted the censure without argument. She then applied to serve as a legal consultant to the new Cold March Representative Council, on the grounds that she knew exactly where all the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking, and that knowledge should go somewhere useful. The application was, after a great deal of discussion, approved. Riva Holt was promoted. She accepted this with approximately the same warmth she accepted everything, which is to say, a curt nod and an immediate request for the parameters of her new operational responsibilities. Mara Ashveil returned to Braywater for 1 month to settle her affairs, and then moved to the northern citadel of Vorith on an open-ended basis. She and Mara had a great deal of conversation to catch up on, and both of them were determined to have it at a pace that was real rather than rushed. The iron cuff fragments from the Ashenveil courtyard were collected and melted down. They were recast into a small plaque that was installed at the entrance to the new Cold March Community Hall. It read, "What is suppressed does not disappear. It waits. Build nothing on the silence of another person." 6 months after the courtyard. Spring in the Ardenmoor. The snow had not disappeared from the mountain peaks, but the lower slopes were beginning to exhale, the first new growth pushing through the frost crust. The particular light of late afternoon that belongs specifically to the transition between winter and whatever comes next. Mara was sitting on the steps of the northern citadel's garden terrace when Calder found her. She was reading, not a genealogy chart or a legal document, a novel, small, battered, found in the Citadel library in the section that appeared never to have been touched. He sat beside her without asking, which he had learned she preferred to being asked, and for a few minutes they were simply 2 people on stone steps in the last of the afternoon light. "I keep waiting for it to feel normal," Mara said, without looking up from the page. "What?" "Not being afraid." She turned the page. I've been not afraid for 6 months now, and it still feels like I'm borrowing it. Calder considered this seriously, the way he considered everything. It stops feeling borrowed, he said, slowly. And then one day you realize you've stopped checking whether the weight is still there. She looked at him. Speaking from experience? Speaking from the last 6 months, he said. She closed the book. The brand on her ankle caught the afternoon light and held it, warm amber gold against the stone step. I spent 22 years being told the weight was me, Mara said. That the chain was my nature. That the iron was a mercy. She paused. The hardest part isn't the freedom. The hardest part is learning that the story they told me about myself was never mine. Calder reached over. His hand covered hers on the closed book. Whose is it now? He asked. She thought about a girl on her knees in the snow, with no wolf and no pack and no name that hadn't been given to her by the people who needed her to stay small. She thought about white light and an iron cuff shattering. She thought about a king who had carried his dying wolf alone for 3 years and had chosen, in the end, to be saved. Mine, Mara said. The mountain exhaled around them. Somewhere below in the citadel's main courtyard, the sounds of daily life carried up in the warm spring air. Voices, movement, the particular ordinary sound of a world going on. Above them, the first star of the evening appeared in the pale sky. Not announced, not dramatic, just there, the way it had always been, waiting for the dark to be dark enough to show it. Mara looked at it and did not look away. And that is the story of Mara Ashveil, the girl they chained before she could walk, because they knew exactly what she was going to become. Before you go, I want to leave you with 2 questions. Drop your answers in the comments because I read every single one. First, if you had spent 22 years being told the most powerful thing about you was the most dangerous thing about you, what would you do with the first day of freedom? Second, Calder built his entire identity around being unmovable, and it was slowly killing him. What is the thing you are holding alone right now that you haven't let anyone carry with you? If this story found you tonight, if something in Mara's journey felt like something you needed to hear, please share it. Not for the algorithm, because stories like this are meant to travel. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you are here next week. Because the next story we are telling is about a woman who made a bargain with the most feared supernatural arbitrator on the continent to save her dying pack, and didn't read the fine print. You don't want to miss the moment she figures out what she actually signed. I will see you there.